The NFL didn't question Shedeur Sanders' arm strength. They didn't question his accuracy. They didn't even question whether he could operate an offense under pressure. What they questioned was something much harder to measure: his presence. And that's where this whole story gets uncomfortable. Because when Shedeur started sliding down draft boards, the language around him shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't about mechanics or decision-making. It wasn't about footwork or progressions. It became about vibes, about intangibles, about whether he was too flashy, too confident, or too comfortable. Let's slow that down for a second. Too comfortable. Since when did confidence become a draft liability? Quarterbacks are supposed to command a room. They're supposed to walk into a huddle like they own it. They're supposed to believe they're the best player on the field. But somewhere along the way, when Shedeur did exactly that, it wasn't framed as leadership. It was framed as attitude. And that's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Because we've seen confident quarterbacks before. We've seen swagger celebrated. We've seen bold personalities called competitive fire. We've watched guys manipulate draft leverage and get praised for being strategic. We've watched quarterbacks bet on themselves and get labeled as smart businessmen. But when Shedeur carries himself with that same certainty, the tone changes. Why? That's the real question here. This isn't about one draft slot. It's not even about one franchise passing on him. It's about how narratives are built. It's about which traits get amplified and which get scrutinized. It's about who gets to be bold and who gets told to tone it down. Because if you strip away the noise, the tape doesn't scream problem. The production doesn't scream liability. The leadership under pressure doesn't scream risk. So when the conversation pivots to personality, you have to ask yourself what's really being evaluated. And here's the twist. The more you look at how this unfolded, the less it feels like a football decision, and the more it feels like a comfort decision. A calculation about optics, about control, about whether an organization is ready for a quarterback who doesn't shrink. And once you start seeing it through that lens, the draft slide stops looking random. It starts looking patterned. And that's where this story really begins. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was subtle. Early in the process, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders was normal. Arm talent, touch on deep balls, pocket movement, processing speed. Analysts broke down his footwork. Scouts debated system fit. It was football talk. Then something changed. As draft season heated up, the language started drifting away from tape and toward tone. Suddenly, you heard words like flashy, polarizing, big personality. None of those are disqualifiers on their own, but in the NFL draft ecosystem, they can quietly become red flags. Notice what wasn't being questioned. It wasn't toughness. He took hits and stood tall. It wasn't production. The numbers were there. It wasn't spotlight experience. He played under more cameras than most college quarterbacks ever see. So if the resume checked out, why did the conversation start circling back to how he carried himself? That's where narrative enters the room. Draft evaluation isn't just about physical traits. It's about projection, about comfort, about imagining this player as the face of your franchise. And when a quarterback walks in already confident, already polished, already brand aware, it forces teams to ask a different kind of question. Can we manage that? Because here's the quiet truth. Organizations don't just draft talent. They draft control. They draft predictability. They draft personalities they believe will fit neatly inside their structure. And Shedeur doesn't feel neat. He feels self-assured. He feels media-ready. He feels like someone who understands his leverage. And for some front offices, that's inspiring. For others, it's unsettling. This is where the word intangibles becomes powerful. It's vague enough to mean anything. Leadership, humility, coachability, maturity, or simply comfort level. When evaluators can't clearly criticize the film, they lean into feel. And feel is influenced by perception. And perception is shaped by bias, conscious or not. So as the board shifted and his name slid lower than expected, the explanation wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet. He's talented, but... And in draft language, that but carries weight. Because once that narrative takes hold, it spreads. Teams become cautious. Nobody wants to be the one who misread the room. Nobody wants to gamble on the personality that other teams hesitated on. And just like that, the conversation isn't about throws anymore. It's about comfort. And that's where the double standard starts to show. Here, where things get uncomfortable. Because if confidence was the concern, then we've seen this movie before, just with very different reactions. Think about how swagger has been treated in past quarterback narratives. When Baker Mayfield planted a flag at midfield and talked big in press conferences, it was framed as competitive fire. When Johnny Manziel partied and leaned into the spotlight, people called him electric, unpredictable, sure, but captivating. When Eli Manning and John Elway leveraged draft power to control where they landed, it wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. Even Bo Jackson choosing his own path was seen as bold, powerful, almost mythical. So why does the tone shift when Shedeur Sanders walks in with the same certainty? That's the tension. Because Shedeur isn't chaotic, he's not reckless, he's not loud for attention, he's calculated, measured, media-trained, he speaks clearly, he carries himself like someone who expects to succeed. And somehow, that becomes polarizing. It's subtle, but listen closely to how the adjectives change. Swagger becomes flashy, confidence becomes cocky, media presence becomes distraction, brand awareness becomes too focused on the spotlight. Same traits, different framing. And this isn't about claiming some grand conspiracy. It's about pattern recognition, about noticing how comfort levels shift depending on who's delivering the confidence. Quarterback is the most symbolic position in sports. It's leadership. It's face of the franchise energy. And historically, there's been an unspoken prototype of what that leadership should look like, how it should sound, how it should behave, how it should be packaged. When someone fits that mold, boldness feels natural. When someone challenges that mold, boldness feels threatening. That's the difference. Shedeur doesn't walk into rooms asking permission. He doesn't shrink to make evaluators comfortable. He understands his value. He understands branding. He understands leverage. And in a league that thrives on structure and hierarchy, that kind of self-possession can make decision makers hesitate. Because it raises a question they don't always like confronting. Is he too independent? And here's the irony, independence is exactly what franchises want when things get tough. They want a quarterback who doesn't flinch, who doesn't fold under pressure, who believes he belongs. But belief hits differently when it's visible. So when draft boards started sliding and the explanation sounded vague, it wasn't about arm talent anymore. It wasn't about mechanics. It was about optics. And once optics enter the conversation, football becomes secondary. Here's the part that rarely gets discussed publicly. The NFL doesn't just evaluate quarterbacks based on talent. It evaluates them based on control. Control of narrative. Control of personality. Control of leverage. Rookie contracts are structured to favor teams. The draft itself is built on the idea that franchises decide where players go, not the other way around. The system works best when prospects enter it grateful, hungry, and dependent. Now, imagine a quarterback who doesn't feel dependent. Shedeur Sanders entered the process already financially secure, already nationally visible, already backed by one of the most iconic figures in sports. He didn't need the NFL spotlight to create one. He walked in with his own. That changes the dynamic. Because when a player isn't desperate, the power balance shifts. And power shifts make institutions uncomfortable. Think about it. If a quarterback is brand-aware, media-trained, and comfortable speaking directly to fans through social platforms, he controls more of his narrative. He doesn't rely entirely on traditional media framing. He doesn't shrink from criticism. He doesn't need to be molded into something marketable. He already is. And that independence can feel like unpredictability to front offices. Organizations love leaders, but they prefer leaders who rise within their structure. They prefer personalities they believe they can guide, shape, and develop. A quarterback who already understands business, branding, and leverage forces teams to ask a harder question. Are we ready for that? This isn't about rebellion. Shedeur hasn't shown signs of being uncoachable or disruptive, but he carries himself like someone who knows his value. And in a league where rookie deals are tightly slotted and career arcs are often dictated by team stability, that awareness subtly shifts negotiating power. Even nil changed the landscape. College athletes aren't walking into the league financially empty anymore. Some arrive with brand deals, followers, and outside income. That means they don't cling to contracts the same way prospects did 15 years ago. That evolution matters. Because when control loosens, decision makers get cautious. They lean toward the safer personality, the lower profile pick, the one who blends in rather than stands out. And that's how the narrative slides from football to field. Not because of what he did wrong on the field, but because of how comfortable he looked off it. And that's where this story moves from evaluation to evolution. Now imagine you're sitting in a draft room. It's late. The board is thinning. The cameras are outside. Ownership is watching. And the next quarterback decision might define your job security. In that moment, talent matters, but comfort matters too. General managers don't just ask, "Can he play?" They ask, "Can we handle everything that comes with him?" That includes media attention, fan reaction, locker room dynamics, national spotlight, and yes, personality. This is where the safe pick, psychology kicks in. A quarterback who blends and feels manageable. A quarterback who doesn't challenge the prototype feels predictable. Even if his upside is slightly lower, the emotional risk feels smaller. You can justify it. You can defend it. You can explain it. But a quarterback who walks in confident, media-ready, and already carrying a powerful last name, that's different. That's louder. Even if he says nothing controversial, the presence alone becomes part of the evaluation. It's not written on scouting reports, but it's discussed. Are we prepared for this spotlight? Will this become a distraction? Will expectations spiral? Notice how none of those questions are about throwing mechanics. They're about optics. And optics influence decisions more than people admit. Humility becomes a moving target. What does it look like? Who defines it? Does humility mean quiet? Does it mean deflecting praise? Does it mean shrinking yourself to avoid headlines? Because here's the tricky part. Shedeur doesn't appear arrogant. He appears assured. But in high-stakes environments, assurance can be misread as ego if it doesn't fit someone's comfort zone. Teams rarely admit that out loud. Instead, they say things like culture fit, developmental timeline. We went in a different direction, safe phrases, neutral language. But when multiple teams pass on a quarterback whose film says one thing and the narrative says another, it forces a deeper look. Was this about readiness? Or readiness to deal with presence? And the irony is this: franchises crave quarterbacks who don't blink, who command rooms, who don't flinch when cameras flash, who believe they belong. But belief feels different when it's visible from day one. And that discomfort doesn't always show up in press conferences. It shows up quietly on draft night. And that's where perception starts shaping reality. But here, what complicates everything? When you go back to the tape, the story doesn't match the hesitation. Here, where the conversation splits in two. Because when you strip away commentary and go back to the actual film, The hesitation starts to feel disconnected from reality. Turn on the tape. You see a quarterback standing tall in collapsing pockets. You see him absorb hits and still deliver strikes downfield. You see anticipation throws layered over linebackers before windows fully open. You see someone who isn't rattled by pressure, not pass rush pressure, not scoreboard pressure, not national spotlight pressure. That matters. Quarterback evaluation is supposed to revolve around traits that translate on Sundays: poise, processing speed, timing, toughness. And Shedeur checked more of those boxes than many prospects who were labeled safer. He didn't crumble in big moments. He didn't shrink when cameras were brightest. In fact, he often elevated when the stakes rose. That's not a personality liability. That's competitive wiring. And yet the doubt persisted. If the film doesn't scream risk, then why does the narrative? That's the disconnect. Because the same confidence that shows up in press conferences shows up in tight windows. The same self-belief that makes headlines is the same belief that allows a quarterback to attempt a throw others won't even try. You can't separate the mindset from the performance. You don't get clutch quarterbacks without visible confidence. But here, where evaluation becomes tricky, when scouts struggle to poke holes in mechanics, they pivot to intangibles, and intangibles are subjective. They're shaped by perception, by comfort levels, by personal bias, conscious or unconscious. So instead of saying he can't make that throw, the conversation becomes, is he mature enough? Instead of saying he struggles reading coverage, it becomes, we're not sure how he fits our culture. Again, none of those critiques are explosive. They're soft, subtle, hard to disprove. And that's what makes them powerful. Because once doubt is planted, even if it's vague, it spreads. One team hesitates, then another. Suddenly, the slide gains momentum, not because of performance gaps, but because nobody wants to be the outlier who misjudged the personality. But history shows something interesting. When quarterbacks with chips on their shoulders finally land in the right environment, the narrative flips. Arrogance becomes aura. Flashy becomes fearless. Polarizing becomes marketable. And if that pattern repeats here, this draft slide won't be remembered as caution. It'll be remembered as motivation. And that's where this story starts looking less like a setback and more like setup. If you zoom out, this isn't a new storyline. It just feels new because the spotlight is brighter now. The NFL has a history of hesitating on quarterbacks who don't fit the traditional mold, not because they lacked ability, but because they disrupted expectations. They were too mobile, too outspoken, too flashy, too confident. The adjectives change over time, but the pattern doesn't. Then something interesting happens. They win. And once they win, the narrative rewrites itself almost overnight. What was once called arrogance becomes swagger. What was labeled distraction becomes star power. What was framed as risky becomes visionary. The same traits that made executives uncomfortable suddenly become the franchise's marketing campaign. That's the part people forget. Draft night evaluations are snapshots. They're opinions formed under pressure, but careers unfold in chapters. And quarterbacks who enter the league with something to prove often carry that chip like fuel. That's why draft slides can be dangerous. Because hesitation plants motivation. If Shedeur lands in a stable system, with a coaching staff that understands how to harness both confidence and composure, the very traits that made some teams cautious could become competitive advantages. His media readiness becomes leadership. His brand awareness becomes marketability. His visible self-belief becomes locker room gravity. And here, another layer. The quarterback prototype itself is evolving. The modern league rewards personality. It rewards visibility. It rewards players who can command both a huddle and a camera. Social media has flattened the distance between athlete and audience. Quarterbacks aren't just team leaders anymore. They're brand anchors. That shift matters because younger fans don't fear confidence. They're drawn to it. They don't want sanitized personalities. They want authenticity. And Shedeur doesn't appear manufactured. He appears comfortable in his own skin. Which brings us back to the core tension. Was this hesitation about readiness, or was it about readiness for change? Because once a player succeeds, the mold adjusts. It always does. The league adapts, the prototype widens, and what once felt unconventional becomes standard. If that cycle repeats here, this draft slide won't age quietly. It'll age loudly. And the teams that passed will be forced to answer a different question later. Not, were we cautious enough, but did we overthink it? And that's when the narrative really flips. Here's the bigger picture. Quarterback used to mean one thing: controlled tone, conservative image, say the right things, blend into the franchise machine. Leadership was defined by restraint. Marketability was secondary to predictability. That era is fading. The modern quarterback is expected to do more than throw touchdowns. He's expected to command the digital space, build a following, represent the franchise globally, handle controversy in real time, speak directly to fans without filters. And Shedeur Sanders was built in that environment. He didn't grow into media awareness, he grew up in it. Cameras weren't foreign. Branding wasn't accidental. Pressure wasn't new. That doesn't make him distracted. It makes him prepared for the modern stage. But transitions are uncomfortable. Whenever an archetype shifts, there's resistance. Not loud resistance, quiet resistance. The kind that shows up as hesitation, as vague concerns, as teams choosing familiarity over evolution. Because evolving means surrendering some control. When a quarterback already understands leverage, already controls his narrative, already carries cultural momentum, the franchise doesn't own the spotlight entirely anymore. They share it, and that shared spotlight feels different from the old model. But here, what history teaches us. The league always adapts to success. Once enough quarterbacks thrive under the new archetype, confident, brand-aware, unapologetically visible, that archetype becomes normal. It stops feeling risky. It starts feeling necessary. And the next generation won't be asked to tone it down. They'll be asked to amplify it. So the question isn't whether Shedeur fits the old mold. It's whether the old mold still matters. Because if he succeeds, if he wins, leads, and produces, the narrative won't just flip for him. It will widen the definition of what a franchise quarterback can look like, how he can speak, how he can carry himself, how comfortable he can be in his own skin. That's bigger than one draft slot. That's cultural evolution inside a league built on tradition. And when you frame it that way, the draft slide stops looking like doubt. It starts looking like transition. And transitions are messy before they're obvious. Which brings us to the final question. Was this really about football? Or was it about the league adjusting to a new kind of leader? Now we get to the layer most people don't talk about: projection. Drafting a quarterback isn't just about who he is today. It's about who decision makers believe he'll become. And that belief is shaped by more than film. It's shaped by imagination. When executives sit in those rooms, they're not only watching throws, they're visualizing press conferences, endorsements, national interviews after playoff losses, crisis moments, locker room speeches. They're asking themselves, can I see this guy as the face of our franchise? Projection is emotional, and emotion introduces bias. If a quarterback feels familiar, projection is easy. You've seen the template before. You know how the story usually unfolds. You can picture it clearly. But when a quarterback feels different, louder in presence, stronger in identity, more self-contained, projection becomes harder. Not because he can't lead, but because the evaluator hasn't seen that version lead in their system before. That's the subtle risk. Shedeur doesn't present as unfinished clay. He doesn't look like someone waiting to be molded. He looks like someone already formed. And when a player appears fully formed, teams subconsciously wonder how much influence they'll have over shaping him. Again, not rebellion, not defiance, just independence. And independence in a quarterback can be interpreted two ways: empowering or threatening. If he wins, it's empowering. If he struggles, it becomes, "We should have known." That fear of being wrong drives conservative decisions. Because if you draft the safe prospect and he fails, you can explain it. The tape said he was solid. Everyone had him rated there. The blame is shared. But if you draft the bold personality and it doesn't work, you're alone in that gamble. That's the psychology of hesitation. It's rarely about one throw or one interview answer. It's about the weight of projection under pressure. And here's the twist. Projection is often wrong. The quarterbacks who redefine the position rarely look comfortable to traditionalists at first. They look different. They sound different. They carry themselves differently. Until they win. And once they win, the same traits that felt risky suddenly feel visionary. So the real debate isn't whether Shedeur had talent. It's whether teams evaluated what they saw or projected what they feared. And that difference might shape how this draft class is remembered years from now. So now we circle back to the question that's been hovering over this entire conversation. Was this really about football? Or was it about comfort? Because when you break everything down, the tape, the production, the toughness, the spotlight experience, the football resume doesn't scream hesitation. It doesn't wave red flags. It doesn't explain a narrative shift built around tone and presence. What it does show is a quarterback who believes he belongs. And maybe that's what made some rooms uneasy. Confidence is easy to celebrate when it fits expectation. It's harder to process when it challenges it. The NFL has always said it wants leaders, but leadership comes in different forms. Some lead quietly, some lead with charisma, some lead by example, some lead with visible certainty. Shedeur's leadership style doesn't shrink. That doesn't automatically make it right, and it doesn't automatically make it wrong, but it does make it different, and different forces evaluation rooms to confront their own preferences. This isn't about accusing anyone of anything dramatic. It's about recognizing how narratives form, how perception shapes projection, how fit sometimes becomes a stand-in for familiarity. Because if we're honest, the league doesn't just evaluate talent, it evaluates comfort with that talent. And history tells us something important. When quarterbacks who were doubted for their presence start winning, the story flips fast. Suddenly, the confidence looks visionary, the swagger looks magnetic, the brand awareness looks strategic. The league doesn't resist evolution forever. It adjusts once success demands it. So the real debate isn't whether Shedeur can throw, or whether he can handle pressure, or whether he understands the spotlight. The real debate is this: did teams pass on a quarterback because of what he lacks, or because of what he represents? And if he succeeds, if he wins, commands, and delivers, this won't be remembered as a cautionary draft slide. It'll be remembered as a moment when the league hesitated, right before the archetype shifted. And that's what makes this story bigger than one player. It's about what leadership is allowed to look like, and whether the NFL is ready for the next version of it.